Today we'll be cutting up the Panamera in preparation for the wide body. Alright guys, so last time you saw I installed the new wheels and tires, and of course they do not fit at all. We've got about a 3.5 inch poke on the rear and about a 3-inch poke on the front. But more importantly, because they are sitting where they are with the offset way outside, I cannot turn at all. It took me about a 20-point turn just to get it in on the lift. And of course, if I hit any bump at all, it would rub here on the top, and the same with the rear. So the idea today is to cut out everything I have to make sure there is still full drivability on this car, so I can turn the wheel the whole way, I can hit bumps without rubbing anything. So in the front, it's a little bit more simple because this is just a fender that bolts on. So you can basically just cut out the fender wherever you need to. You don't really have to worry about anything structural. And then I'm gonna obviously need to cut out of the bumper here as well to make sure I can turn completely. And in the back here, it's a little bit better, but I do see some of the unibody there sticking out. But it looks like most of that is just like the end of a piece of structure that it's welded further back, so I could cut that if I need to. We'll see. I need to be able to turn the front first to even know if that's an issue, so we'll see about that one. But the rear is always more complicated on most modern cars because it is a unibody. This outer part of the body is welded to basically the inner part of the body that is up in the wheel well. So if you watch my Mustang series, you'll see what I did there. I believe I'm gonna do something similar on this one. So basically you cut the outer skin and then you trim a bunch of stuff, and then you basically fold up the inner skin to touch the outer skin, and then you kind of stitch weld that back together to make sure you're not losing any of the rigidity of the car. And with this being a 4-door, the door is right here. So obviously I'm gonna have to cut some of the door itself, but then behind here, it's still basically the same setup where there's an outer skin and an inner skin here. So we'll see how much I need to cut out of that, but I might need to also do some welding in that area. Then of course I'm gonna have to cut some of the rear bumper, but you know, that's just plastic, so it's not a huge deal there. And this will likely be somewhat of an iterative process to cut a little bit, see what it looks like, see how much I can turn, maybe go for a drive, make sure nothing's rubbing, come back and maybe cut a little bit more. I don't wanna go too crazy because then if it's like too far back, then my wide body's gonna be really impacted by what I cut out. But of course I wanna cut it far enough that I never really have to worry about anything rubbing. So now we can start drawing some lines and get to cutting. All right, guys, I've now got everything cut out the way I want. So basically in the front, for the front fenders, I took off about 3 inches right on top of the tire. And then from there, I kind of worked off of the tire to take off kind of an even amount so I have even travel clearance the whole way around. So you can see in the front, took off the fender, and then the bumper was just plastic, so that's not a big deal. And then behind the wheel, I went down, and then it goes back to normal about right here, so I didn't actually cut off anything down here. So then I just tried to kind of blend it in. And then you can see I then did repaint the edge of the fender there. So this fender was aluminum. So not particularly worried about it rusting, but it will corrode eventually. So I put some paint on that. And then really the biggest issue up front here was this rear part of the subframe that I thought may be an issue. So basically there was another almost like an inch of flange here going the whole way around this that you saw me cut off. And basically it was this end plate was more of like a cup shape with that flange the whole way around, and then this structure extended and met that flange. And it was basically just glued, epoxied, like panel bonder together. So I essentially cut off that whole flange, so there was no longer really a good glue joint. So after I cut that off, I basically did a bunch of tacks of welding the whole way around. And then to really shore it up, I then did use panel bonder, and that's what you kind of see here. So I did the panel bonder the whole way around, seal it up, and it also helps with the structural rigidity. So then after that, I just did a primer and a paint, just basically a general purpose for metal and meant to resist rusting. So then outside of that, in the front, when I turned the wheel, it was very close to hitting the intercooler. You can't see it now because I put this fender liner back on, but the edge of the actual intercooler is like right here. So I basically had to really cut up this shroud that goes onto that intercooler. And then also this grill here was actually attached to this fender liner. So I cut it out of there and then pushed it back and attached it to the shroud. So basically everything is back a lot further. So I should be good now with clearance. It'll still be a little bit tight, but it's really only at full lock, so I'm not super worried about it. And then the same thing up top here. This is basically like the headlight mount, and then the part of kind of the bottom of the headlight here. So I had to cut out a lot of that. And then I even changed some hardware here just to make it more low profile. And again, that's really at full lock. It's kind of getting close here, but usually you're only using full lock like when you're parking. So hopefully it's not too much of an issue. I can always raise the car a little bit if I really need to. So then I did the same thing on both sides, of course. This side I already have the fender liner kind of back in. I did a bunch of cutting to that, and I will probably add to it actually in this area so that I don't get any rocks or anything going up there. But for now, it just should be enough clearance. I basically lined it up with the fender where I cut it. And then onto the rear here, it was kind of easier in a way that the wheels at least don't turn, but also you're really dealing with the whole unibody structure of the car. So up on top here, it's kind of the same thing I did with the Mustang, but then you've got this door to deal with. So I actually cut straight through the door. And surprisingly to me, the doors were also aluminum. So I cut straight through the door, and then basically I was left with this big hole here, this big gap. So what I filled that with was some structural rigid foam. So that's what I've got here, this rigid foam. And then on top of that, I then used the metal panel bond to seal it up and then also give it some more rigidity, because basically once I cut this, you could really squeeze these two pieces of sheet metal together because they're just thin aluminum. So after I did that, this is really nice and strong. And that is actually how that seam was put together from the factory with panel bonder. The same with this seam, that was just panel bonder from the factory. So then you can see behind the door, I actually had to cut a good bit of this flange out, but luckily it was still the same construction, basically the inner skin and outer skin. So this whole way from here, the whole way up and around the arch to here, I cut the outer skin the whole way through, and then the inner skin I left long. I cut some slits in it so that I could bend it up to meet the outer skin. And then basically I held it in place as I did tacks the whole way along. I was not worried about doing a full complete weld, just about 5 tacks on each of those little tabs, get some structure there. But then I knew I was then covering this whole thing with the panel bonder, which, like I said, was how it was from the factory. So I've got some welds underneath and panel bonder on top. And then the same thing, I did the primer and paint just to protect everything. This one is steel, so you definitely want to have a good coat of paint all over that. And I even drilled some holes the whole way up through here so that I could then use that long nozzle with some primer, and it actually had a 360 head on it, so I stuck that up there in an effort to be painting behind all where I welded, so it's not just raw steel. But I then did cover those holes back up with the panel bonder. And as you can see, the other side is exactly the same. So we've got the door cut, then with rigid foam, panel bonder, and then the entire arch cut, welded, panel bonder, and primer and paint. So yeah, this doesn't look like the greatest finished surface, but all of this is going to be hidden with the new wide body. Really, once you step back, it doesn't look that out of the ordinary because I tried to keep a pretty decent curve the whole way around to maximize my clearance from the tire. And in the rear, I did a little bit more. I did 3.5 inches on the top of the tire, and then I basically matched that clearance the whole way around on both sides. And next time we will actually be 3D scanning the car so that we know exactly how much I cut out of the fenders, exactly where the new wheels and tires sit, and that will really aid me in designing the new wide body.